Okay, so here's the thing for today. I need to learn more about the agricultural sciences, about the field, the discipline, the technologies, the techniques, and how these all came about. And I actually know very little about this. I know more about food policy and stuff like that. So why don't we try to learn about this together? Actually, I already dipped my toes into some of the most absolutely basic stuff. I went to the Britannic Encyclopedia, for example, and they have a nice categorization of all the different subfields of the agricultural sciences. I think it is nice to look at that if you want to get a sense of the interdisciplinary nature of agriculture, in case you're not that familiar with that. And then they have some claims about something very interesting, the thing that I was curious about. When does agricultural science begin? And I hope that hearing that question stirs your brain a little bit, because it is a difficult question, even a problematic one. Britannica talks about a guy called Justus von Liebig, who seemingly came up with the first proper application of organic chemistry to agriculture. And then Wikipedia talks about this guy called Jethro Tull. Cool band, by the way. Anyway, the thing with Tull is that he's a very popular figure as a forerunner of agricultural engineering. The guy came up with a machine that automated seeding. Although scholars agree that he was definitely not the first to do this, he's just more of a, folk popular figure. And I think that this was enough warm up, enough general information for me to take the next step into my study of the agricultural sciences and the history of the agricultural sciences. And I think that the next step is to figure out what specific questions do I want to answer? And what are the problems and complications that I can already predict? And what do I already know about these things? I mean, what are my assumptions? And I mention this because I think that when studying, you should then wait after you read and after you have studied a lot to then come up with your own opinions and assumptions and theories, which is something that I see a lot of students do. I think that you should start the other way around. You should start with your assumptions, with the things that you can predict that will happen. Try to do some mental work to actually think of what is it that you may find out there. And then you use your reading and your studying to put to the test your assumptions. Anyway, so back to the core question that's intriguing me. And that is, when does agricultural science begin? Now, think just about that question with me. What could be the problems that we could face if we try to follow that question, if we try to answer it? Or in other words, how can I be critical with the question that I'm asking instead of just following along with it? And I think that a good first step to approach this is to ask, the fuck do we mean by science? Is the invention of efficiency increasing technologies an expression of science? And therefore something like tools, automatic seeding machine, the start of agricultural science, which is basically the assumption that I found in Wikipedia? Or is science the university, specifically the research university and everything that aligns with its canon? And therefore the agricultural sciences start when agricultural sciences become a topic in universities? Or the agricultural sciences happen only when the hard natural sciences are applied to agriculture, regardless of it being inside or not a university. And that's the case with Liebig. He is the first one to apply organic chemistry to agriculture. And then you have the Encyclopedia Britannica, a major authoritative outlet of knowledge on the internet, basically recognizing the guy as the one responsible for starting agricultural science. But beyond these possible answers, there is a giant elephant in the room when we ask this question of when does the agricultural sciences begin? Again, beyond these, answers that I mentioned. And the thing is that agriculture, preceding any kind of European research university, seems to be very knowledge and technology intensive. It is as if agriculture was innately scientific. This seems to be the case almost by definition. After all, what could resemble more the stereotypical experimental and controlled approach of scientists than approaching the land, a natural environment, to control it, to delimit space in it, to input seeds in it, to control the growth of these seeds, and to also put chemical inputs into the land? It just sounds like a laboratory experiment. And the whole operation, of course, is highly specialized because it presupposes a lot of knowledge about the soil, the knowledge about the natural environment in which the soil exists. That's the knowledge of the water, of the bogs, of the seasons. It implies knowledge about the plants that you're growing. And then it implies knowledge about harvesting, storing, cooking, distributing, preserving, whatnot. And of course, at a large societal level, it also implies the management knowledge necessary to have enough food to keep the population alive. So you have environmental knowledge and knowledge about plants and knowledge about seasons and weather and technical knowledge and also economic and populational knowledge. And I guess that in other non-Western civilizations, it could be argued that this is not yet scientific knowledge. And you could argue that it is not because it is not being recorded so that then it can be systematically improved and revised. But god damn it, again, to maintain a large population alive, you need to have a pretty refined control and knowledge about the sources of food and the amount of food that you can produce and store. And that kind of management implies recording and pretty efficient recording. And to have efficient recording to sustain a population, well, you need to revise those recordings, you need to revise your knowledge. So we kind of check that box too. And then, of course, in most agricultural societies, you have some sort of institution where there's education about these practices. And so you have also that dimension of education, of knowledge that is being passed and also recorded, maybe not in a textual way, but at least recorded in memory, recorded in voice, recorded in practices. So it feels to me like we're checking all the boxes, we're checking them all. And I think that this situation leads to a very, very important question. Again, if agriculture seems so innately technical, innately knowledge intensive, innately management intensive, innately recording intensive, innately revision and improvement intensive, then doesn't that mean that agriculture has always been scientific? And if that is the case, how could it make sense to talk about the start of agricultural science? We will only need to say that agricultural science starts when agriculture starts. But this also leads to this funny and a little bit weird of a conclusion, which is, if indeed agriculture has always been scientific, and if agriculture is one of the first technical, societally organized practices of humans, then maybe it is the other way around, and science is the thing that starts with agriculture. Okay, but maybe there's no real problem here. Maybe I don't need to go that far with all my thoughts. Maybe I am the problem here because I am just trying to answer a question that's too broad, too big. And this may not allow me to do my learning. So maybe instead, what I need to do is to step back a little bit and to put limits to the question and to the topic that I actually want to study. And so in the case of agricultural science, I just need to put strong limits to the idea, to the concept of agricultural science, to the definition. And it does make sense to do that by defining the agricultural sciences as a thing that starts with the European Research University model. I mean, that's where the name science starts as we understand it. Of course, that word goes way back, but in terms of research and modern understanding of science, and it is in the European Research University where it starts. And so we just need limits. But if it comes down to that, then there's an important question that we need to ask. And here's the thing, here's the big problem of who the hell understands science as that? Who the hell understands science as the thing that starts with the European Research University? Not even science itself as an institution. Because if we talk about science as an institution, well, science has the pretense of being the source and the representative of universal knowledge. And I think we all know this pretty well. The pretense is that scientific knowledge, knowledge produced by the institutions of science, is truthful, is the best available knowledge, is the source of true justified beliefs, if you want. Scientific knowledge, scientific claims do not have the pretense of being truthful only in certain contexts or in certain places. organic chemistry is not supposed to be truthful only in Germany. But way more important than whatever pretense this global institution has, this is the understanding that the general public has. This is how most people understand science. And this is a word that is massively spread out, that is massively significant to our societies. Just the word science grants authority, it is powerful simply as an idea. And so this is one of those words that we have to be pretty responsible about. And I think that, again, the case of agriculture and agricultural sciences makes it very clear why. Because if we talk of science to refer to authoritative, true, legitimate knowledge, but then we only assign the label of science knowledge that's produced by European research universities, even when so many different cultures hold knowledge that meets all the standards that we associate with scientific knowledge, then that just becomes a pretty obvious way of delegitimizing any sort of culture and knowledge of everything that's non-European, or at least not in that Western canon. Why does the Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia grant the status of scientific to the contributions of Toole or of Liebig, but not grant that same status to other previous, ancient, way older traditions, technologies, techniques of agriculture? Why do these two massive outlets of knowledge, probably the first ones that the average person will find, why are these not recognizing non-Western technologies, non-Western knowledge as equally valid or scientific? Well, maybe it has to do with the history of colonialism. After all, that's part of how you dominate other cultures. If you happen to be a sovereign, powerful nation, well, if you want to take control over other populations, a great way of doing so is by taking control over their basic subsistence resources, over their food and their systems of food production. And if agriculture by itself at a societal level is highly technical, highly technological, and highly knowledge intensive, then it does make a lot of sense that you as the dominator will want to take control over that knowledge. And what a better way to claim to have power over others than to claim to have truthful knowledge, the right knowledge about how to do things and about how things are. So it sounds like a pretty good technique of power, of domination, to claim to have truthful knowledge about food and about how to make your own food, and probably about how to eat it too. And isn't this kind of imposition of scientific knowledge what we have seen when we have seen international organizations or big powerful nations like the US especially starting agricultural projects in other countries where basically they have imposed scientific products like genetically engineered versions of certain seeds and certain crops, or certain types of fertilizers, or monoculture and certain techniques of agriculture, when they have imposed these techniques as the truthfully most efficient way of producing food? Isn't there a lot of assumptions about science and scientific knowledge being truthful? Not only at the scale of how to control food and the land and the soil and the food, but also at the level of being truthful about how to, again, efficiently produce food and how to feed a population. So, has science be there just to erase culturally diverse ways of understanding and of having knowledge about agriculture and food? Now, these are just a bunch of assumptions I have just made, and I have reading all of that stuff in the last 30 minutes. Well, not precisely now. I wrote this maybe 2 weeks ago. Now, obviously, these are educated opinions, although not only opinions, but also, heartfelt concerns. But anyway, the point is that I cannot just sit here with my assumptions and take my assumptions for granted or expect you to believe all the stuff that I have just said now. But articulating it and expressing it, that is a pretty good way of starting my study. Because now I have a clear idea of what are my assumptions, and now I can put them to the test and challenge them. You should challenge them too. And so I revisited these things that I said, these things that I wrote 2 weeks ago, and I noted a lot of things. So first, the major point. I have talked about how agriculture resembles so much typical scientific practice. And I get that point. I get that point because I understand how I can perceive that just agriculture in itself is a technological act. That makes sense, but then I talk about more specific stuff, like systems and institutions of education for agriculture, or systems and institutions for recording agricultural production, or for managing the distribution and storing of food. And of course, I use often the word control for talking about the control over the land. But there are a couple of problems when I do that. There may be some truth to the fact that education and management and land control or environmental control are all present in any agricultural practice of any society that practice agriculture. But if I now that I will start my study on non-Western agricultural practices, if I approach it by trying to find these things, by trying to find systems of education, of management, of land control, whatever, by doing that, am I not imposing my ideas, my previous understanding of agriculture into other agricultural practices of other non-Western cultures? By doing that, wouldn't I be imposing my understanding of all of these things, my understanding of education and management and whatnot? And if I do this with the purpose of acknowledging that there's something scientific about these non-Western agricultural practices, for the purpose of legitimizing them, am I not assuming that they are not legitimate on their own? Am I not assuming that they are not legitimate if they actually do not fit my concept of science? And of course, there's the very important fact that I'm talking very broadly about non-Western cultures and their realities, that these can be and are pretty freaking different. And I cannot just approach this as assuming that they're all the same. That can even be kind of fucking racist. And so then I face this tough question. How do I approach the study of cultural differences without imposing my own concepts and framings, but also without being patronizing? And how can I study the agricultural practices of non-Western civilization societies with explicit goal of trying to bring more legitimacy to them? How can I do that if I come from the point of view of academia, of the place of the sciences? Well, maybe the answer is not that complicated. And maybe it is something that I already mentioned. When studying, all my assumptions should be put to the test. So yeah, it will make sense to use the categories that I have because that's the thing that I have. It will make sense to try to find institutions and practices of education and, again, soil management and soil control and alteration and population and record management, etc. But maybe the goal should be not only to find these things, but to find the way in which these practices challenge my understanding of each of these things. How do the things that I recognize as education in other cultures go beyond my understanding of education and challenge my previous understanding of education? And the same thing with, I know, the other things, the soil management, production management, storing management, etc. Because isn't that the point of learning, after all, to learn something new? And I think that that whole process of critique should end up going back to this question of science and of there being or not being agricultural sciences in other non-Western cultures. Maybe the more profound question that I'm pursuing, that I'm trying to answer, should be, how do agricultural practices and how do agricultural knowledge in non-Western and non-Westernized cultures and civilizations, how do those practices and knowledge totally challenge my understanding not only of agriculture, but how do they challenge my understanding of science? And I think that that approach also allows me to get back to what I think really matters to me here. The real concerns that I have and that motivate me are about the role that this very, very freaking powerful thing, which is science, both the institutions of science and just the freaking idea of science, how these things have played a role in our societies and in our international intercultural interactions. The truth is, of course, that for the most part, scientific knowledge institutions and the idea have played a role, as complicit in colonial enterprises and in other awful enterprises by big powerful nations. As a very nice little article states, agriculture is the cornerstone of colonialism. And especially if that's the case, then the question becomes very urgent of what role is science, again, institutions, and idea playing nowadays in the way in which we live as a global society? Is it playing the right role? Are we still doing with science and with agriculture and with the agricultural sciences the awful things that we have done in the past? And whatever the answer, then the question, in the context of a global, international, intercultural world with different institutions of knowledge and with different institutions and traditions and histories of technologies and technical abilities, in that context, what is the role that we want science to play from here into the future?